just to fill you in, we will hopefully be Skyping in from The Hague Wei Wei Nu, who is a Rohingya activist and has been speaking out on these issues for some years. She was a political prisoner herself and is now running a women's network, which also works in the camps in Cox's Bazar and also in New York and other international circles lobbying. So she's been at the hearings. The hearing at the International Court of Justice is on as we speak. It's the final day of the 2-day commencement of that case, and Aung San Suu Kyi is taking the floor, I think, at some point, probably in about an hour or two, right, Kingsley? We'll keep an eye on it. We might switch over. They're live streaming it if people are interested, or we might show a bit afterwards. But meanwhile, we thought we'd kick off with Kingsley Abbott of the ICJ to perhaps explain a little bit about the confusing welter of cases and actions that are now on against Myanmar. And ICJ, the International Court of Justice in The Hague, is the first such case to kick off. So over to you, Kingsley.
Thanks very much, Gwen, and good evening, everyone. I say it's a pleasure to be here. It's not really a pleasure to be here. It's a very difficult time. I just flew in from Yangon a couple of hours ago, spending the week there. The situation is complex and emotional. I am a senior legal advisor with the International Commission of Jurists, which is an international legal NGO based in Switzerland. I'm responsible for our work on accountability around the world, based here in Thailand. And we have been following the situation in Myanmar very closely. I'm not a Myanmar expert. I don't profess to be. There's probably people in this room who know much more than I do. I've been following the legal developments, and particularly the case at the International Court of Justice, which we will focus on a little bit tonight because it's happening as we speak. I think the first thing to begin with is to say that there is no question that serious violations of international law amounting to crimes under international law have taken place in Myanmar, and not just in northern Rakhine, but in other parts of the country too. This has been extensively documented by different UN bodies, independent investigations, organisations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Fortify Rights, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Special Rapporteur's Office, and you'll all be aware of the United Nations fact-finding mission's reports, the first one, which ran to 444 pages, having conducted hundreds of interviews, concluding that to a certain evidential standard, we are looking at potentially war crimes, crimes against humanity, and maybe even genocide. That's our starting point. Those are the allegations, and they are credible. So there must be accountability. There has to be accountability. Who has the primary obligation to investigate and prosecute? Myanmar. Myanmar, the state, has that obligation. And if Myanmar was conducting investigations and prosecutions that met international law and standards, there would not be a need for some of these international efforts that we are talking about. The International Criminal Court would legally have no interest. It would rather not be involved in an investigation into Myanmar, for example. We're here because Myanmar is not doing anywhere near enough. We can talk on another occasion about what Myanmar is doing. Some of you will be aware. They are conducting, they say, some processes through military courts, which have, for the most part, acted as a shield to accountability. It's a matter of international law that serious human rights violations shouldn't be prosecuted in a military court. That's for military justice, military issues. Serious human rights violations should be prosecuted in a civilian court. And there are certainly not investigations and prosecutions into the type of crimes that we're looking at here. There's also, as you are aware, the International Commission of Inquiry that is yet to produce its report. The International Commission of Inquiry cannot be properly described as an accountability mechanism. For it to be an accountability mechanism, it would have to be independent, impartial, transparent, and it is none of those things at this stage. Some members of the ICOE have been on the record saying, look, we're not here to point fingers, and quite what they are doing is unclear and lacking in transparency. So what other efforts have then been initiated to fill this space, somewhat reluctantly? And they are all imperfect, but they are all important, and those of us who work closely in this area would rather that they weren't necessary. First of all, 2 years ago, the prospects of accountability looked bleak. It was pretty grim. Myanmar wasn't conducting investigations. Myanmar had not ratified and has not ratified the Rome Statute, so the ICC did not appear to be able to get involved. The UN Security Council had not referred the situation to the International Criminal Court for it to conduct investigations, and no countries were able to exercise what we call universal jurisdiction to conduct their own investigations and prosecutions because they simply didn't have the information or the evidence to do so. But fast forward to December 2019, the situation has changed. We now have, just a few days ago, it announced that the International Criminal Court will now conduct a full investigation into a certain category of crimes, those which have a cross-border component where the victims have ended up in Bangladesh. We also have a universal jurisdiction filing in Argentina. We have the Human Rights Council created the IIMM, the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, which is mandate to conduct full criminal investigations into all of Myanmar going back to 2011. It's not a court, but its role is to share its evidence with those who are able to bring prosecutions. Maybe the International Criminal Court, maybe Argentina, maybe elsewhere. And then, of course, we have the case before the International Court of Justice, which I'll talk about now. The International Court of Justice is different to all those other mechanisms in that the International Court of Justice is established to resolve or adjudicate disputes between states. It's interested in state responsibility. Whereas all those other mechanisms, the International Criminal Court, the IIMM, the proceedings in Argentina are focused on what we call individual criminal responsibility. They're investigating whether particular individuals are criminally responsible. So I prepared a little slide at the request of Gwen because there's a lot of confusion about what is the ICC, what is the ICJ, are they the same, are they different? The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, sometimes gets confused with us, the International Commission of Jurists. From time to time, people welcome me into meetings saying, it is a tremendous pleasure to have you among us, Your Honour. And I have to say, no, I'm not a judge of the International Court of Justice. But it is confusing because the International Court of Justice is based in The Hague, in the Netherlands, and the International Criminal Court is based in The Hague, the Netherlands, and they have similar acronyms. They are both, if you like, active now on the Myanmar situation. That's the International Court of Justice in a building what is known as the Peace Palace, a beautiful building in The Hague. And here are some photos of what it looks like inside. You can see there's a 15 judges, a 15-member bench, which sometimes enlarges to 17 because if a country doesn't have a judge from its country sitting on the bench already, they can nominate an ad hoc judge. And that's what's happened in this case, actually. Myanmar has nominated an ad hoc judge. The Gambia has nominated an ad hoc judge, so there's 17 sitting in that room, and they adjudicate on disputes between states. It's established by the UN Charter. So for all countries who are members of the UN system, who have ratified the UN Charter, they have agreed legally to have disputes with other states settled here at the ICJ, part of what you often hear, the sort of rules-based international system, whereby in the old days states would just go to war when they disagreed. Now, as a matter of peace and security, states agree to go there. So it's an incredibly important institution, and it sits right at the highest point in the highest court in the UN system. It has two functions. One is to settle disputes between states, which is what we're talking about here in the case of Myanmar. It also has a different function, like an advisory function, where UN bodies and UN agencies can bring legal questions to the ICJ for it to provide legal answers. Here are some photos from the proceeding as it's happening now. You can see Aung San Suu Kyi sitting there, her counsel, William Shabas and others. That is the Minister of Justice and Attorney General for the Gambia, who is the agent of the Gambia in bringing the case. And there's Aung San Suu Kyi. She opened the case for Myanmar, which is what an agent does. The Attorney General for the Gambia opened the case for the Gambia, and then lawyers went on to make legal submissions. We're on day 3 now. So day 1 was the Gambia making its submissions. Day 2 was Myanmar's reply. And now day 3 is the morning with the Gambia replying to Myanmar. And any time now, Myanmar will have the final say. And we're not sure whether she will be the person who makes the final submissions for Myanmar. The International Criminal Court, as you probably know, also in The Hague in the Netherlands. Different building, entirely different function. It's not a UN body, it's created by treaty, and states agree to be part of it by ratifying the Rome Statute. It concerns itself with 4 categories of international crimes, conducts investigations and prosecutions of individuals. That's the criminal courtroom of the International Criminal Court. The prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, who coincidentally is also from the Gambia. The Attorney General of the Gambia, who's bringing the case at the ICJ, himself was an international criminal lawyer. He was a lawyer at the ICTR, the Rwanda tribunal that was based in Tanzania, and has a natural interest then in accountability for crimes under international law. I'll zoom in quickly then into, well, what is this case all about? Because it's not all that straightforward. But it's not that complicated when you look at the detail. Essentially, the Gambia and Myanmar are both parties to the Genocide Convention. And in the Genocide Convention, it says that if 2 parties to the Genocide Convention have a dispute, a disagreement, they can resolve that dispute before the International Court of Justice. So the Gambia has said, we have a dispute with Myanmar about the fact that it is in violation of its obligations under the Genocide Convention. It alleges that Myanmar has committed genocide, has conspired to commit genocide, has incited genocide, has failed to prevent genocide, has failed to punish genocide, and has failed to enact domestic legislation criminalizing genocide. A litany of allegations. And that process is what's called the merits of the case, and it could take some years for there to be a final judgment on that. It will take a long time to get to that point based on precedent in the court. There is an issue also of the fact that a tremendous amount of evidence may have to be presented before the court in order for it to make that determination. And it may not get there because there may be some preliminary arguments yet to be made about whether the court has jurisdiction or not, technical legal arguments. The point is that it is potentially a long haul. So why are we in court this week? What's all that about? Well, the Gambia also made an application at the same time for what's called provisional measures, which are easy to understand in that basically they are saying this situation is urgent. We believe that a genocide is unfolding. We believe that people continue to be at risk in northern Rakhine, and so we want the court to freeze the situation to push pause, to capture it so it doesn't get any worse. And specifically, they've asked the court to order Myanmar to prevent further acts of genocide, to not commit any acts of genocide, to allow access to where evidence might be and not to destroy any evidence, to preserve it. And they've also asked that everybody comes back to the court in 4 months' time and reports on whether or not those orders have been implemented or not, if they are made, if the orders are made. And in oral argument just the day before yesterday, they also asked for the additional provisional measure, which is that Myanmar allows access to UN investigatory bodies. Now, it is possible that these orders will be made. It's not certain, but it's possible. And if they are made, it is significant, enormously significant, because the orders of the International Court of Justice are binding on states. The fact that the Myanmar government is sitting there in the court arguing within the framework of international law is no small matter. If Myanmar does not implement those provisional measures, if they're ordered, where is recourse? Recourse is to the UN Security Council. Nothing is automatic there. It would require the tabling of a resolution to say Myanmar has not done X, Y, and Z as ordered by the International Court of Justice. Here is what we think the response should be, set out in a resolution. Of course, that resolution is then subject to potential veto, the potential veto of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. I'll finish by just making a few points. There are quite a number of different legal considerations that are taken into account when determining whether to impose provisional measures or not. First of all, it has to be established that there's prima facie jurisdiction, that the Gambia has the right under the law to bring this case. The fact that the rights of the Rohingya people may be affected by these alleged violations of the Convention has to be plausible. There has to be real or imminent risk of irreparable prejudice. And the Gambia has essentially said there's no doubt that all of these factors are present. The Gambia stood up and made the argument that we are very comfortably within the ballpark here of a case of genocide, and these measures are therefore necessary. Everybody was interested to know what Myanmar's response would be, and in a nutshell, it was interesting in that Myanmar said essentially they were responding to a terrorist threat by ASA. It was a security operation. They conceded that there may have been a disproportionate use of force. In other words, they conceded there may have been violations that were committed in that context, but they certainly were not genocide. Genocide is a notoriously difficult crime to prove, requiring proof of special intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. And they said, look, there may have been some violations, we're willing to admit that, but it wasn't genocide. And in any event, we are conducting investigations. Investigations are ongoing. Why is Aung San Suu Kyi there? Because it is normal practice for states that come before the International Court of Justice to nominate an agent which has the legal power to bind the country, to sign documents on behalf of a country. I can't go on behalf of my country, New Zealand, and sign documents on behalf of my country. Usually the Attorney General goes, the highest lawyer, the Minister of Justice. And so, as I said, the Minister of Justice for the Gambia is gone. She's gone for Myanmar. Legally, for me, it's not that interesting that she is there. But for those who follow Myanmar carefully, follow the politics of Myanmar, perspectives of the international community, perspectives of minority groups and the people of Myanmar, it is very interesting, and I think my friend Jonathan may touch on that. I'll finish by saying, and there's a lot to be said and I welcome questions, I finish by saying that one of the concerns that we have in all of this is that whilst we strongly support the work of the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and other such accountability initiatives, there is a real concern about, A, the possibility that the victims will be left behind in all of this. There is little understanding of the detail of many of these initiatives inside Myanmar for a variety of reasons, right down to very practical reasons, like when these cases were being streamed inside Yangon when I was there yesterday. the interpreters just were unable to keep up with all the legal jargon, missing sentences, and a lot of the newspaper reports, I was told, really just focused on what Aung San Suu Kyi said and not the other arguments. When I visited the camps in Cox's Bazar, many of the people there who are, I think up to 80% illiterate, simply don't know, and how could they know the difference between the IIMM, the ICJ, the ICC? And so all of these initiatives need to do much more, need to do much better, and we need to do much better, civil society, regional civil society, international civil society, to bring these processes closer to the ground if they're going to have any meaning whatsoever for the victims who are supposed to be the ones that are being included in these processes so that their calls for justice are answered. I think also there are real concerns about issues of witness protection of witnesses, protections of victims. There's so much trust that they will be okay because a lot of people don't fully understand these processes. But we are here talking about alleged perpetrators who still have authority inside the country. This is not like where I was a lawyer advising investigators in Cambodia, where we were conducting an investigation into the Khmer Rouge 27 years after the crimes were committed. This is, I think, what the Americans would say, a fluid situation. So I would lastly call on different missions, diplomats, these mechanisms, all of us and donors, if different missions are present here, to really give some thought to outreach, to educating the different victims and witnesses so that they're not left behind in these processes, and to ensure that at every step people are thinking, how can I take these steps without doing any harm to the people concerned? What do I need to do in order to ensure that these people are not harmed by participating in these processes? But I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Kingsley. Just one point, actually, before, and we're also just trying to hook up Wai Wai Nu, but she might be involved in the proceedings at the moment. Just one point, which is, given everything you've said and how we know how difficult this whole thing is going to hinge on establishing absolute sort of certainty that there was intent to commit genocide. It sort of seems to be that it's heading towards a war of semantics, really, of language, like what do you call it? I mean, clearly from what we've seen, there were very serious crimes, as you said, war crimes possibly. But will these cases actually come down to sort of niggling about actual terminology and both proving genocide but also intent, which is a very tricky thing to prove, really?
Yeah, it is, Gwen, and those are really good points. One of the unfortunate facts about this case, and it's present whenever there are allegations of genocide made, is that the possibility and gravity of other crimes start to sometimes fade into the background. And it happened in Cambodia in some ways and in other parts of the world where suddenly, and you see it a lot in the media, genocide is sort of the king of crimes, and crimes against humanity start to sort of take on this role of being sort of coming second place,
like shoplifting,
sort of the bronze medal, and crimes against humanity are crimes against humanity.
Pretty serious.
You can technically have a genocide where nobody dies. Right. You could have intent to destroy or whole and apart a protected group by preventing births or by bringing about the conditions of life. You could have crimes against humanity of extermination with 1 million killed. And so one of the challenges of the fact that the ICJ is now the first court to consider this case is that it can only look at genocide, very difficult crime to prove, because it legally can only look through the lens of the Genocide Convention. So if the court over time determines that there was no genocide, which is possible, and this is where the expectations of victims and others, I think, is so important, that court will not go on to make findings as to whether or not they were, on the other hand, crimes against humanity.
Whereas the ICC can?
Whereas the ICC and the IIMM will look at wherever the evidence takes them. So when the ICC conducts its full investigation, which it's now doing, In this case, it's a little technically complicated because it's limited through various legal reasons we can talk about to only focus on crimes where they ended up in Bangladesh. But the IIMM is basically looking at all serious human rights violations throughout all the countries since 2011. And if the evidence takes them to a conclusion that there may have been a genocide, then that is where they can go. But again, both those processes will take some time and are not guaranteed.
Right. Thanks for that. We might move on to you, Jonathan,
Sure.
because we haven't got... And just to... I'm sure a lot of you in this room have seen Jonathan's reports. He's actually been covering Myanmar on and off for how many decades?
But 18 years.
18 years. But Jonathan famously did some brilliant and brave coverage in northern Rakhine shortly after the massive crackdowns, initially in late 2015, and had some very powerful footage of young Rakhine Buddhist youths were amidst burning villages, and had interviews with the locals there, and that's all, I think, available online. It's riveting television, but tonight you're going to focus on more the lady on the screen. Over to you. Let's
I actually thought I'd bring some perspective, of my own perspective, to the international environment in which this is happening. I mean, what happens in the court is obviously incredibly important, and it was now down to a lot of legal technicalities. I mean, for me, there is something extraordinary about witnessing these proceedings in The Hague, where you have two of the world's greatest theorists, the people who best framed the arguments about genocide and crimes against humanity, Philippe Sands and William Schobas, who are lawyers for either side. So you've got two of the greatest minds on these issues arguing for each side. So this is historically, on the issue of the issue of genocide, a very important moment. And you know, these people have been involved in the debate about genocide and crimes against humanity and how you define them, going back for a very long time, and indeed looked at the Nuremberg trials back in 1946, where we first heard the term genocide being used, and which of course now is very relevant to what we're assessing in Myanmar. I was based in Turkey for 3 years, between 2009 and 2012, and one of the things I remember about that was every April 25th we'd go through the routine of people preparing around the world to try to highlight the genocide of the Armenians back in 1915, and the Turkish state taking great efforts to try and push back those efforts. By the time I was in Turkey, Turkey had moved on a lot, and most educated Turks were perfectly willing to acknowledge that dreadful things had been done to the Armenians back in 1915. But I remember Turkish officials used to say to me, look, we will accept all sorts of things were done, but you cannot expect us to roll over and accept being branded with the G word. It was the big word for them. They said, if we accept this, if we accept that we did a genocide, we are now in the same camp as Nazi Germany and Rwanda, and we can never accept that. And I can't help thinking that that may well be going through the mind of Aung San Suu Kyi right now in these arguments at The Hague, that at all costs to resist the tarring of genocide, as Kingsley says, the A-list of crimes. I feel in Europe that we've lived in the shadow of the Holocaust right up to the present day, and that our sense of how the world should be ordered and what's acceptable and unacceptable for states to do is very much coloured by our continuing horror over events in Europe in the 1930s and 40s, but it's not the same here in Asia. And I think we're seeing that with a lot of regional reactions to the atrocities, the Rohingya atrocities. I mean, you have to remember that Asia is a region where, for example, unlike Germany, Japan essentially put up a wall in 1945 around its experiences of the Second World War and just chose to blank them out and to move on into a modern world of technological and trade-based peaceful progress and put it behind them. Japan isn't the only country. Indonesia is a country that had the most appalling massacre in 1965, and yet today its survivors and relatives of the victims cannot get any open acknowledgement of what happened. You could argue some of the same, frankly, here in Thailand. Not so dramatic, but the events in 1976 when students were butchered at Thammasat University, hardly ever acknowledged. In Asia, there seems to be, instead of this tremendous sense of moral imperative to account for horrible crimes, a desire to push them under the carpet and bury them. I think there's always a sense for us in the Western world when we're confronted by an outrage like the brutal attacks on the Rohingyas back in 2017 and before that, that something must be done to stop it and to bring the perpetrators to justice. But what we have to consider is the periods in which it's been possible to do something effective have been quite limited. I mean, there were the famous Nuremberg trials, of course, where Nazis were brought to justice for their crimes. But of course, even they were to some degree tarred by the allegation this was victor's justice, that it was effectively a justice imposed on a vanquished enemy. And the Tokyo trials were even more qualified to some degree by this idea that it was victor's justice. I would say the heyday of effective international intervention was right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We saw the height of the influence of the United Nations, the first significant interventions that were backed across by all the great powers in the UN Security Council in places like Cambodia. One of the stories that I covered early on in my career was the birth of East Timor in 1999. And even as notionally impartial journalists, we shared a feeling of real outrage as after the people of East Timor got a vote for independence in August of 1999, Indonesian troops and their militia surrogates went on this rampage, a murderous rampage, and there was this tremendous sense something must be done, and something was done. Because it was the heyday of internationalism, the US, Russia was at that stage very weak. China needed US support to grow. It was sort of emerging economically, and there was a consensus, certainly among the US and European powers, that Indonesia should be stopped. And Indonesia was too weak to resist, really, economically. The whole of Asia was reeling from the economic crisis. This was the time you saw East Timor, you saw effective intervention in Kosovo, you saw reasonably effective intervention in Sierra Leone. Since then, of course, we've had the fiasco in Iraq, we've had the outcomes of the failed Arab uprisings 8 years ago, and then the dreadful outcomes we've seen in Libya and Egypt, and most of all, of course, Syria, where there's been this tremendous sense of international impotence, and now, the once proud global actors that we saw, particularly Britain and the United States, have sort of turned inward, no longer so interested in playing, righting international wrongs and playing this kind of a role. So it's not a great time for the Rohingyas to be seeking the world's help right now. China's approach to the Rohingya crisis appears to be solely influenced by its concern to maintain stability on the border between Bangladesh and Myanmar and maintain the best possible relations with each side. China has pushed relentlessly on the issue of repatriations, for which the conditions are evidently not right. It's clearly not possible, and yet China has been pushing that. That's been its diplomatic initiative largely. It's done very little else. I first visited Rakhine State in November 2012. I'd actually covered the plight of Rohingyas before then, particularly when Ranger boat people were turned up in Thailand in 2009 and were pushed out to sea by the Thai Navy and left to drift there. It was my first chance to go, and as it happened, on my way there, I stopped off in Naypyidaw, and I was able, it's one of the very first times this has ever happened, to doorstop Aung San Suu Kyi when she was then an opposition leader, and ask her about the issue of the Rohingya and their plight. And that this was right after these two terrible bouts of communal violence in June and October. As you saw from the Al Jazeera documentary, strong evidence then of the state siding against the Muslims and participating in the violence. Tam, I'm just going to play this video now, if that's okay.
Whether you've been able to advance your position on the Rakhine issue, whether you're willing to support citizenship for Rohingya people.
I have said that citizenship will be granted in line with the citizenship laws. So I understand that the Minister for Immigration said that they were looking into it, and those who have been here 2 generations will be granted citizenship. So I think this is something you must take up with his department to see how far they have got.
What's your own view about what should happen?
I think the what is absolutely necessary now is rule of law. I understand that unrest is spreading, that communal violence is spreading, and if we're to stop it, the people will have to feel secure. Until they feel secure, they will not be prepared to sit down to talk about peace or understanding or mutual respect or any of those things. So we need full security in the region, and we need rule of law in the sense that any violations of human rights or of the law must be dealt with quickly and in line with the basic norms of justice. That is to say, justice must not only be done but seen to be done, so that people will feel secure that their rights are going to be protected.
Well, the discrimination against Rohingya, which has been institutionalized for so long, I mean, can you end that quickly?
No, things like that don't end quickly. I think it would be very unrealistic to think that discrimination which comes from rooted perceptions will vanish overnight. Discrimination, of course, has been part of the official policy of the past governments for decades, and not just against the Muslim population, but also against the Buddhist population in the provinces. I understand that Buddhist Rakhine also have had problems about getting national registration cards, which are necessary for a lot of work that you need to get done on a day-to-day basis in this country.
Do you accept the Rohingya are a special case there, because the discrimination against them has been, not having citizenship, not being able to move about, that their status is an urgent matter?
I think that human rights is special to every single human individual. I don't think you can say that human rights should be limited only to a particular community.
Will you urge your supporters to accept the idea that Rohingya should be citizens of this country?
I will support the idea that those who are entitled to citizenship under the citizenship laws should be given citizenship.
But the law is unjust.
Well, that is, I've always said that there are two steps to rule of law with regard to citizenship. First of all, you have to find out whether citizenship has been granted in line with existing laws, and secondly, whether existing laws are in line with internationally acceptable standards. So this is something the government will have to look into.
So
and of course the legislature
surely you
as well.
can't accept a law that leaves an entire group of nearly 1 million people out of citizenship. That must be, in your view, that must be unjust, surely.
I think the question is, does it leave 1 million people out? And why are they left out? I don't think I can say I agree with this or I agree with that when I have not been supplied with any kind of statistics to show who are entitled under what law and why those who are not entitled are considered not to be entitled. How can we make spot judgments like that?
But you have exceptional moral leadership here. You're urging for tolerance, for accepting
Yes,
of people who are disliked.
I'm urging tolerance, but I do not think one should misuse one's moral leadership, if you want to call it that, to promote a particular cause without really looking into the basic, the sources of the problems. I know that people want me to take one side or the other, so both sides are displeased because I will not take a stand with them. But my stand is that first let us establish rule of law and let's make people feel secure. And then let's look into the other problems, because if people are killing one another and setting fire to one another's houses, how are we going to come to any kind of reasonable settlement?
You're not used to getting press criticism, but you must have noticed the comments in the international media saying...
No, I've always had press criticism.
You failed on this account because you haven't spoken out.
Well, I won't speak out. And if people think that this is a failure, I'm ready to accept it. I won't speak out because I do not think it will help the situation. And I don't think you should speak out or not speak out because of the possibility of criticism. You speak out or you don't speak out because you think this is the right line to take. And by the way, I must remind you that I'm used to press criticism. I've come in for a lot of press criticism over the last 2.5 decades, and I don't know why people think I haven't.
I think on the issue of the Rakhine, you've got huge numbers of people here in Burma saying they should be driven out of the country, and people are saying, surely you of all people should be coming forward saying, you can't say that.
You can't say that. As I say, rule of law. You just don't drive people out without reference to what the laws of the land are, and without reference to what the needs of human rights are.
But you don't say that more publicly, coming out saying we shouldn't say this.
I have said this often enough, but also not forgetting that the Buddhist Rakhine have also been subjected to human rights violations. by the authorities in the past. And of course, both communities have violated human rights with regard to one another.
Right, well, that was her very non-committal view of violence, which at the time had been continuing on and off for 5 months. Of course, there were victims on both sides, but disproportionately they were Muslim Rohingyas. We know of at least one large-scale massacre which took place in a village called Yan Te near Mrak U, less than 2 weeks before I spoke to Aung San Suu Kyi, where 70 Muslims were murdered. She just didn't acknowledge it at all at the time, and I think that sort of staying away from this difficult issue was a principle that she stuck to right the way through and after the election when she finally started leading the country. I found other things on that trip as well when I went in to see the displaced Muslims in Sittwe, that many of them were not even Rohingyas. There were Kaman Muslims among them who had been driven out, particularly out of a town called Chaupyu, who were living in these miserable IDP camps. They've never been able to go back. So, they're not even tarnished with this idea of being Bengalis, the sort of term they use now. A year later, I went back to the camps around Sittwe. 130,000 Muslims remained in squalid camps. They were barred from going to the capital, Sittwe, for any jobs or for medical treatment. I was able to visit one village in Ratidong in 2013, where the Rohingya village, which had been there for more than 100 years, was entirely encircled by hostile Rakhine Buddhist communities, effectively besieged. They couldn't move, and they had security forces holding them in. They literally couldn't get out there at all. It was very obvious to us when we looked at that this was a form of apartheid. It was when we started realizing the term, that this was a reasonable parallel to use. The forced segregation and the fact that it was going on and that it was enforced by the security forces, that they were not allowed to move. As Gwen says, I was able to go back into Rakhine State within 12 days after the attacks of the 25th of August and witnessed the massive extent of the destruction that was going on, villages being burnt, villages that had been burnt. We were on a government trip. It was extremely limited. We couldn't get out wherever we wanted to, and yet they just couldn't hide what was going on. As Gwen says, we did see one village being set alight by young Rakhine Buddhist men with police standing around, and they told us the police had more or less said to them, go ahead and do it. It was a village that had already been abandoned by its Muslim population, and in fact I was able to meet some of the inhabitants later in Cox's Bazar and hear their side of the story and how they'd been driven out by a campaign of terror by the military. And of course we got the terrible accounts even in those early days from the refugees in Bangladesh, far too many to discount, which are the basis of the case against Myanmar today. But very few of us who covered that story then were actually surprised by what happened, perhaps by the ferocity of the violence against the Rohingyas on the 25th of August, but not by the way it had happened. We'd seen already previous attacks in October of 2016 and seen tens of thousands of people driven across the border then. Everyone knew what would be coming. There were reports of increased military presence building up in northern Rakhine State in the weeks before the ASA attacks. One place I was allowed to visit on that trip in September of 2017 was a town called Alel Tanjore. It was one of the first towns to be attacked by ASA. When I say ASA had been operating for some years by then. The way that it was described to me by the inhabitants of villages is the militants would come and recruit young men. Usually they had the support of the local imam, and often that would dictate whether the village supported or didn't support them. And young men would be taken to the hills to be given the most rudimentary training. They had very few guns. They were told how to build bombs out of engine blocks, but I don't think they ever got very good at it. The attack on Alel Tanjore, the police commander there described it as a mob of probably 300 or 400 men running towards the police barracks. They'd been forewarned, so the police were inside. They'd kind of barricaded themselves in with the Buddhist population, and they simply opened fire on them. The Rohingya men had been told that ASA would be coming in to reinforce them with automatic weapons. That never happened. They were simply shot down. A lot of them were hurt or killed, and they then ran away. And that was pretty much, I think, the pattern of those 30 attacks that we saw on the 25th of August. But before that, knowing the military build-up, seeing the tension rising, there were killings on both sides. ASA militants were killing alleged informers. other people were being killed in mysterious circumstances, something was definitely coming, and the authorities knew for sure it was coming. And the big question is, could it have been stopped, or was it deliberately allowed to go ahead? And I think it is one thing that investigators will continue to look at. There is at least circumstantial evidence that with the amount the authorities knew about the impending attacks on the 25th of August, it's not plausible for them to argue that there was a shock terrorist attack that justified their response. And of course, since then, what have we seen? We've seen access to outside agencies, even those able to offer aid to both communities, cut off, no independent media reporting from Rakhine State, no measures that might actually make Rohingyas feel possibly safe enough to start thinking about coming back, and damaged Rohingya villages completely erased from the map. One of the most notorious killings you may remember from 2017 was the murder of 10 unarmed men in a village called Indin. That case became famous because two Reuters journalists, very brave journalists, who investigated it in extraordinary detail, were then prosecuted and sent to jail and got out after an immense international campaign after a year. It was one of the only cases where the Myanmar authorities opened up and acknowledged that their forces had actually killed people illegally and extrajudicially. But there's actually something else that you should know about Indin. I mean, I was able to go there on my latest government trip, where I went in August this year, and it's a very sinister place because surprisingly, they even take journalists there. It was a village in which 3/4 of the population was Muslim, and about a quarter, perhaps a little over a quarter, were Rakhine Buddhist. And when you go there now, the Muslim quarter has completely vanished. It has been bulldozed. See, there's no sign it was ever there, and covered with a giant police barracks. But Indin is noteworthy for another reason. There was a study conducted by the Center for Diversity and National Harmony in Yangon. It's an NGO trying to stem the trend towards intolerance in Myanmar back in early 2016, before these ARSA attacks. They studied 5 communities and how they'd been affected by that earlier violence in 2012. What they found was Indin, unusually, was a community where the Muslims and the Rakhine Buddhists got on so well that they were able to ride out the tension of the violence of 2012, maintain peaceful relations, good cooperation, and come through without any conflict at all. If any community ought to have been able to ride out the violence of 2017 had it been given a chance, you would have thought Indin would be it. It was clear that relations between the two communities were very strong. What we know from the Reuters investigation is that there was an ARSA attack on a post probably about 4 kilometers north. It made people very nervous in India. The Buddhist community actually went and took shelter in a monastery, but there were no attacks there at all. And that the security forces went in, swept out the Muslim community, took these 10 men aside, executed them, shot them into a ditch, and then basically, having driven the Muslim population out, then set fire and destroyed the remaining community. I think Indin will be a very interesting case for investigators going into detail who are trying to prove either crimes against humanity or genocide when we look at intent and so exactly what happened there. I'll finish with a final story that tells you something about the state of play in Rakhine State. On my way back, I stopped off. We all have to fly into Sitwe to get to Rakhine State, and then you go on these boat journeys to go up to these areas if you're allowed to by the government. On my way back, I went to meet a young Rohingya man that I befriended on social media. I befriended him 2 years ago, but I, of course, never been able to meet him because the Myanmar authorities ban any unauthorized contact between journalists and Rohingyas. We're simply not allowed to do it. We have to sign a piece of paper when we get a visa saying we'll follow rules, and one of the rules is clearly stated: you cannot contact Muslim communities without getting permission from the authorities, which you'll never get. But I was able, and of course this young man is living in the camps. His family were quite well off and lived in Sitwe, and they were driven out during the violence of June of 2012, so they'd been driven out a long time before. He was a very bright young student and was planning to go to university. I managed to get to see him. You have to use all sorts of subterfuge and find a sort of halfway Muslim village that's outside the Sitwe, but where we could get in not being noticed, basically, and we get probably about half an hour where you could safely talk to him before we had to get out. And, it was really telling talking to this young man. He is one of the brightest young men I've met, very energetic. And yet he's been stuck, festering in a camp for 7.5 years. No, he's not allowed to undertake any kind of education. He can't travel. He can't leave this area at all. He has lots of potential, but he'll never, ever be able to realize it. And there are still in Rakhine State, at least 130,000, many more Rohingyas. The guess about the population in Rakhine State is probably about 400,000 who are left there after the mass exodus, all of them living in the most precarious and difficult conditions. And it's something that, even after all this talk from the Myanmar government, nothing has been done to change. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Jonathan, for that fantastic on-the-ground account. And wonder when your next trip back there is. I think right now we're just trying to get hold of Wei Wei Nu in The Hague. Do we know the timing, Kingsley, for...
I'm told that the hearings will commence at 4:30, and it's now 2:30, so we're...
Oh, right,
we're
yeah.
not gonna catch the hearings.
No, that's fine. So, actually, perhaps I could just address, there's what to me I think is a burning issue, and I've covered Myanmar myself for some time and visited a few of the Rohingya camps inside Myanmar and also visited Bangladesh. It strikes me that one thing that I think is getting eclipsed in all the international attention on the court cases and grappling to try and get across the various court cases is the fact that there is a looming funding crisis in the camps. There's 1 million people who are, nothing's been settled about their future. As we've heard about these rather misguided attempts to repatriate them, is there some concern that the kind of sheer sort of overwhelming attention now on the international legal process kind of like undermines, or at least not undermines, but perhaps plays down or marginalises some of the urgency of this issue now, which is really like trying to attend to the situation in the camps and this terrible crackdown going on now in Bangladesh as they cut internet in the camps, restrict what little freedoms the refugees had. Do you have thoughts on that, either of you?
Well, I can just say that I think there's a real problem and it's an old story of exhaustion with what is now a very long-running story. There was a huge amount, massive attention at the time that the Rohingyas first fled. It was a stunning event that really profoundly shocked the world. That was the exodus and the dreadful stories that we heard. And, I think it just probably almost exhausted people to have these one story after another coming out, and then this miserable biblical plight of these people stuck in such vast numbers in these camps where the local environment was totally overwhelmed. That was more than 2 years ago. You just can't keep up that level of international interest, and the exodus has more or less stopped. The stories we've heard, and they've been catalogued and recorded now by, of course, the fact-finding mission as well, but many other groups as well. And it's now one of those grim stories of just day-to-day survival of refugees. As far as the rest of the world is concerned, another refugee camp, the biggest, but you've got, vast numbers of Syrians on the borders in Turkey and Jordan, huge numbers of displaced people in much of Africa. It's just very hard to sustain interest. And with interest, of course, comes funding. Governments are influenced by the level of popular interest there is. We're living in a very cynical age in which the idea of sort of international humanitarian goodwill and intervention, it's lost its luster. Populations are very much focused on home issues. Politics has become very selfish. It's a very difficult time to refocus attention on this sea of people living in the most dreadful conditions in southern Bangladesh. And of course the Bangladesh government, wants the problem resolved and is constantly threatening to take a large chunk of the population and put them on this godforsaken low-lying island in the Bay of Bengal. We don't know if they'll ever get to do that, because moving that number of people against their will would be very, very difficult. But all of those rumblings go on now with very little international interest. I just think people are exhausted.
Right. Thanks. You brought up Bhasan Char, the island off Bangladesh, which was supposed to be the only hope for relief in this, increasing crisis of overcrowding and issues on the Bangladesh border with Myanmar. Kingsley, do you have thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, it's an important point you've raised, Gwen, and we're here talking about accountability, but I think it's important to emphasise that this situation is not only about accountability. That has to be acknowledged. Accountability is one part of the broader mosaic. We're talking about a massive humanitarian crisis too, where there doesn't seem to be resolution in sight right now, as Jonathan said. I hope that what we are seeing now in the international media and the regional media, keeps a focus on that and contributes towards attention not being drawn away. And there are a lot of competing crises around the world at the moment, and hopefully places some pressure on Myanmar to address some of these issues. I think it's also important to emphasise that not only is it not only about accountability, there is rightly so a tremendous amount of emphasis and attention on the Rohingya as a group of victims, as the most affected. But I think it's important to recall that there are many other minority groups who are persecuted throughout Myanmar and Kachin and Shan and elsewhere, who are also victims of serious human rights violations, who must also not be forgotten in all of this. I think that, there are really sort of, worrying anecdotal stories coming out of the camps at the moment, Gwen, in answer to what you just said. A friend of mine just came out of the camps just a few days ago, and we had a telephone conversation, and she was saying to me, like you said, Gwen, that the temperature is getting turned up in the camps by Bangladesh in terms of freedom of movement, internet access. It was difficult for them to watch the live streaming of these proceedings, and they are also feeling a hardening of an attitude across the border in Myanmar, and they're really caught in this no person's land between these two pressures. And so they said to my friend, really all we've got now is the International Court of Justice.
Right.
And for someone like myself who understands, I hope, to some extent what the ICJ can and can't do and what the ICC can and can't do, that causes me some concern, because these processes are important, but they are limited. They have a narrow focus. Somebody in the camp said to me personally when I was there, will the ICC now arrive in the camps and provide us safe access back into Myanmar with a secure perimeter around northern Rakhine to make the Rohingya people secure once and for all from the Tatmadaw who have these allegations against them? And I said no. That is not what the ICC can provide. And there was a lot of emotion and a lot of tears.
Right.
And enormously vulnerable people.
Right.
And for those of you who've been there, and I know some of the people in this room have been there, the vulnerability is overwhelming, and accountability is part of it. I hope it's contributing towards things positively. The people in the camps were very clear when I spoke to them that they want justice. But I also think, going back to what I started by saying some time ago tonight, there really needs to be more done in terms of outreach, communication, involvement, security, so that people who have been affected by these crimes are better able to meaningfully participate in these processes, or decide not to, as the case may be.
Yeah, and right now they probably just want their internet back. But anyway, we've managed to get hold of Wei Wei Nu, the founder and executive director of the Women Peace Network, and a Rohingya representative, and a former political prisoner who's there in the Hague. Wei Wei, I don't know if you just heard Kingsley speak, but he was talking about this kind of, the question of what Rohingya people hope the ICJ and ICC can or can't do. So perhaps you'd like to tell us your view, but first of all, tell us how it's been going in your view in the last 2 days.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me at your panel. I mean, as Mr. Kingsley has rightly said, we have to look into the justice in a broad approach, broad manner. As accountability is one important component. The people in the camps has their own definitions of justice. It is important that we listen to the people, and it's about their dignity, it's about their grief, and it's about their identity, and it's about their, restoring their equal rights as citizens of Burma, and being able to go back home safely and securely with dignity. All of these details, it's very important, and I'm very worried by staying here, listening all the news and listening opinions. I am afraid that people will fall into the trap of legal definitions and determinations, whether it is genocide or not. Actually, for us, it's the truth is at this point there is no question that the mass atrocities has occurred and it continues to occur. So we cannot wait for the legal determination or legal definitions of whether it is genocide or not. We need to take action now, and at the same time we need to broaden the discussions around justice itself, and people cannot wait for the legal definition and determination to whatever it is, because the atrocities continuing in Rakhine State. People in Rakhine State and people in Bangladesh are, as Mr. Kingsley has said, their life is very, very vulnerable. They're living like a subhuman condition. We cannot keep that for long. In Rakhine State, it's been more than 7 years. I mean, the persecution was there for about more than 2 decades, severe form of persecutions, and they're living like prison right now for about 7 years, with very limited access to healthcare, education, food, and all other aspects of rights of their life. So it's really, really urgent condition. So I guess so that's why in all my interviews I'm saying that we cannot wait for the legal definitions and determinations. We need to take action now. We need to, we must, provisional measures are important. At the same time, we must pressure the government to really take immediate and necessary actions to stop the continuous violations and persecutions. For example, even in the last 3 weeks, there are about 300 Rohingya were arrested and sentenced to 2 years jail just because they are trying to escape from the ghetto-like condition, from open prison, from this ghettos in Sittwe, ghettos, this IDP camps, which is confined for many years. They're trying to escape from this living hell, and they have been criminalized, and they're sentenced to 2 years, and it's a lot. It's mean a lot to me. It's public humiliation. It's penalizing their movement. It's been continuing while we are having the court hearing here. It's such a shameful that the head of the state is lying and denying the situations in the ground. So I guess we just it is important, the legal determination. It might take time, and we don't know what will happen, but we really need to say the government of Myanmar to stop this, to stop the policies,
Right.
the practices, and their attitude itself.
So
One
what-
of the things that I want to point out, yes, she even didn't use the term Rohingya in the court. That means a lot, actually. So I think we have to take this issue very seriously. For us, our recognitions of our existence, our identity is a lot, and we see this as a source of the fundamental to all these genocidal policies, and it caused us so much of mental destructions of our entire population.
Right.
So
So maybe you could tell us
yeah.
what kind of urgent action are you talking about? I mean, what's realistic? You say
So what
urgent. You say
yes.
that you want to
So-
see urgent action, but what kind of urgent action are you?
For example, we need to call the government of Myanmar to release all the Rohingya prisoners. Almost all of them had no fair trial, and they were arbitrarily arrested. Second, we need to call Myanmar to stop issuing national verification card, which is actually a tool to finalize their plans against our population, to legalize the Rohingya as non-citizens, and that's the point of it, and we have to stop it.
Right.
So that's the second thing. The third thing is we need government to really process the return of the people, return of the IDPs, and return of the refugees in their places of origin. In the places of origin, not camp closure, and sending them to the permanent structures, permanent camps. We need them to be able to go back to the places of origin, and engage with the Rohingya communities and talk to the Rohingya leaders. The government knows who we all are. They have to talk to the people who can solve people who can solve the solutions and who can find solutions together. They need to talk with the Rohingya.
Right.
And the sincerity shown there until now, since 2012, or at least since 2015, since the Aung San Suu Kyi become president, they haven't been engaging with the Rohingya at all. Rohingya were in no discussions of solutions. There will be no solution without the affected communities. There will be no solution for the Rohingya without Rohingya. That's the most and the urgent thing. I guess at this point, these are the minimum thing and immediate things she can do. Otherwise we need to abolish citizenship law, or we need to amend the citizenship laws and abolish all other local directives and the local practices in the ground.
Right. Could you just coming back to the court hearings, as a representative and an articulate spokesperson for the Rohingya, how do you feel, having seen these opening statements of, well, you've just said what you felt about seeing Aung San Suu Kyi's statement. How do you feel about the Gambia being the ones to bring the case, and then seeing Philip Sands taking on the Rohingya cause? So you're watching this historic... oh dear, have we lost you? I think we've lost her. Can we try and... Maybe it'll come back. I hope. Let's try again. So... That's me. Oh, here she is. Oh, no, that's not her. We're just trying to get her back. Okay, so maybe we can... Actually, I wanted to ask, you touched on this too, Jonathan, or was it Kingsley, the I mean, in many ways, this is a very fascinating encounter between two of the most prominent lawyers in international criminal genocide law that we've got, and that in itself kind of it sort of helps the theatre of the occasion. I mean, what's your take on the legal representation, Kingsley? How important is it?
It seems historic to me to see these two giants.
Yeah, I think this is a sub-narrative that's kind of like, it's only for the sort of people who are really into it, but it strikes me as a movie almost.
It's of tremendous interest to legal academics, legal scholars, legal practitioners. As Jonathan said, you have two leading scholars on either side of this debate, and because one of the things that has to be established is that it is plausible, which is a very low standard at this preliminary stage, that genocide was committed, both lawyers have done a deep dive into the jurisprudence or the body of law surrounding genocide. And
are you surprised which lawyer has gone for which side?
Yeah.
No, and I also, well...
Can I just say, by way of background, Shahbaz was actually on the other side a few years ago, and sort of was one of the most prominent lawyers to say a few years ago that it had the characteristics of genocide, what was happening in Myanmar. He's now defending, well, we don't use the word defend, he's now representing Myanmar, hired by Aung San Suu Kyi and the government. I
mean, the argument put forward by Myanmar's lawyers on this issue of whether genocide has been committed was a very narrow construction of the definition of genocide, setting a very high bar for it to be proved, saying that there must be no other, the court must be satisfied there's no other reasonable alternative other than that it was genocide, and that is what has to be established to a plausible standard at this stage. The lawyers on the other side said, look, that's a misrepresentation of the test. This is an early stage, considering provisional measures. You're mixing up the ultimate test that has to be established during the merit stage. All of this is fascinating to genocide scholars and international lawyers, and I've received, as you can imagine, many messages. I think one of the things to emphasise from my perspective is that I've been a little bit concerned at some points that there has been somewhat of an association by in some quarters of saying that these lawyers are surprisingly taking this position and surprisingly taking that position. This scholar originally said this and now he's defending them. As a practicing lawyer myself, who in the past has in criminal trials defended alleged murderers and defended alleged rapists, I'm very concerned when lawyers start getting aligned with the causes of their clients. That's not the way it's meant to be. In Commonwealth countries like New Zealand and the UK, we have the cab rank rule, where lawyers are obligated to take all cases if they can take them, to protect that. There are countries around the world where when you start getting into a discourse about lawyers taking this side, why is the lawyer doing that, that it can end up very badly for the lawyer. So I think it's very interesting that you do have two lawyers on either side of an argument. Both are scholars. Some have said that both are taking positions consistent with their scholarship. We will see how the court comes down on these legal issues, but it is of tremendous interest to some.
Yes, thanks. And Wei, you're back with us, and that was the question I was asking before we got cut off, and I put it to Kingsley, and Jonathan had brought it up, which is this interplay, the lawyers for both sides. But how do you as a Rohingya representative feel about seeing Gambia and their choice of lawyer be the ones to represent Rohingya people and how did you feel about the opening statements in the case?
I mean, I think I see both lawyers from both parties are really extraordinary, and I have no personal criticism or personal view on the specific lawyers. I just have confidence on the court itself, and since this is International Court of Justice, the highest court in the world, and I would just believe in the process. Whatever legal matters come up, it's really depends on the court to decide. To court opinions matter. So, and having this extraordinary amount of evidence, witness, facts, and materials. This is the crime. The crime is undeniable, and the suffering is unspeakable. And we must hold perpetrators accountable, regardless of genocide or not.
Thank you. And finally, we're running. Yes, sorry.
That's something which I think is quite important, which is the theatre of this matters. I mean, throughout this crisis, since it started, Aung San Suu Kyi has basically stayed at home or just gone mostly to friendly Asian countries. She's been completely cocooned from any real challenge. No, she's done no hard interviews. And for the first time yesterday, or the day before yesterday, we saw Aung San Suu Kyi standing, having to listen in the full glare of publicity, the whole world's eyes on her, the gruesome details of these atrocities. We've all seen them. I mean, they were all documented in the months following the Exodus. They've been written down, journalists have done them, human rights groups have done them. They're very well documented, but to actually see these details read out, and she had to listen to the whole lot. I suspect for many Rohingya people who were able to watch it, that will be the most important moment of all, that their suffering and their accounts of what happened to them have been formally read out and documented in court, and that the woman they hold responsible now, or trying to hold accountable, had to sit and listen in a way that she's not had to do.
Yeah.
Bear in mind, in almost all her diplomatic encounters, when friends often, friendly diplomats have tried to raise with her what they say are uncomfortable truths, she's cut them off.
Yeah.
She hasn't wanted to listen. In The Hague, she's had to listen.
Right. I must say, when I interviewed her a year after the initial attacks, she did deny. And I said, haven't you seen the video footage of villages burning? And what about XYZ? And she said, there's so much disinformation and fake news today. One can't believe television. So I think she was saying she didn't watch it. But I'd just like to take just a few. We're running out of time, and also I know, Weiwei, you're keen to see the closing session at the court today. Does anybody have a question for any of the panellists? We've got time to take one or two. Well, don't all rush to the microphone. Oh, yes, please. And please just...
I do, actually. Thank you. This has been very educational and emotional. But I have a few. I'll try to be.
Could you just tell it?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Shalmali.
Yeah,
I'm Shalmali Guttal. I'm with Focus on the Global South. So, a question to 2 or 3, all of you. One question is, why Gambia? In the Genocide Convention, among the parties, there are many. So, what's the background there that's come up there, so I think maybe Kingsley, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about what's going on there. Another question, and which I guess all of you could answer is, or respond to, is what does it actually take to prove intent? I mean, proving intent and intentionality is one of the oldest philosophical conundrums written about. How do you prove intent? I know there's a criminal legal way of proving intent, but what Jonathan was telling us in terms of going, the amassment. I mean, when you see the amassment of forces, you see all that people know what's coming. Is that not proof of intent? How do you get into someone's mind? And the third question is, how has been the Bangladesh government's response in all this? What has been their response? I mean, I read about what Bangladesh government does and what my own government, India, it's not my government, but it's a government of the country I'm from, is doing with regards to the principle of refoulement by sending Rohingyas back. But how has the Bangladeshi government been with the Rohingya and with this case and with asking for international accountability? Sorry, 3 questions.
So maybe you can share them out, and Wei, you too. Maybe Kingsley,
I
you
can
obviously
try
raring to
and
go on
answer
that
one
one.
and two. Why the Gambia? Well, the Gambia has answered that. They have said because they believe that this is a genocide, and they feel duty-bound to bring this case before the ICJ to have that adjudicated upon. The Gambia is part of a group of states called the OIC, I think it's called Organisation of Islamic Cooperation.
Yes. Used to be changed to.
And that is a block of Islamic states who have met from time to time, and earlier this year, as a block, decided that something needed to be done, and the Gambia put up its hand. And I think real leadership has been shown by the Attorney General of the Gambia, who we've seen in the photographs, who, as I said, happened to be an international criminal lawyer working, I think, for about a decade in Tanzania at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And he has said, and I listened to him in the same room, saying that when he looked at the situation in Myanmar, he felt that, as an expert in these matters, that this is a genocide. And so he said, we, the Gambia, decided to put up our hand. That is why the Gambia. I think, how do you prove intent? Well, intent, or known in legal terms as mens rea, usually a crime has to have both. You learn this in law school, criminal law 101. Actus reus, the Latin, means you have to commit the act, doing it physically, and you have to do it with the intent to if it's a murder case, with the intent to kill. If you kill someone accidentally, it's not murder. If you kill someone and you intend to kill them, it is murder, because you have the criminal intent. With genocide, it's what's called dolus specialis in Latin, special intent. You have to do the act of killing or bringing about the conditions of life with the intent not just to achieve those aims, but with the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. That is very hard to prove. But in criminal law, how do you prove intent? How do you get inside someone's mind without giving you a law lecture? It's usually through one's words or one's actions, direct evidence surrounding circumstances. And, here there will be people who might be looking at what particular individuals have said, maybe on Facebook, what was said in certain meetings, what actions were taken, what is the contextual situation. When you look at the UN fact-finding missions report, they dive into this and say, look, in situations of genocide around the world, we've seen that there are, 10 or more certain indicia that are always present, which should ring alarm bells, that here we're in the ballpark of genocidal intent or a genocide, and they say, look, we think many of those are present in this case. So it can be surrounding circumstances, can be indirect evidence, can be what people said, can be what people did. It can be a range of things that prove genocidal intent. But because you have to show that they were actually doing these things in order to destroy a group, that's a very difficult thing to prove. And has been acknowledged as such. Some even argue that it's too difficult. But others will argue that the Genocide Convention made it such in order for states to be encouraged to ratify it. Had the bar been lower, it may not have been as ratified to the extent that it has been.
Thank you. And you had a couple of other questions. Jonathan, did you have a... Yeah, you got that.
I'm not no great expert on Bangladesh, but from the conversations I've had, you could sum their position up fairly simply, which is that they don't see why they should have to accommodate such a vast number of people in what is a poor and already challenged part of the country. There are problems for the Bangladesh authorities having to host such a vast influx of people. It's had a massive effect on the local economy. It's suppressing, for example, wage rates, because Rohingyas need to find work. They do it illegally and informally at much lower wages. There have been huge environmental pressures. Bangladesh essentially said, we'll take these people, but we expect the international community to help us sort it out. And their position has been all along, they need to go back to Myanmar. The problem is that Myanmar has, on the surface, has said, yes, they can come back. but the conditions have never been created where any refugee would, in their right minds, want to go back, because there are simply no reassurances that what happened to them won't happen again. And every repatriation effort, Bangladesh has gone along with it, with some criticism. Then the last attempt, they didn't actually tell the people they selected beforehand. I mean, it wasn't ideal, but the fact was that Myanmar weeded out most of that number to a very small number, and because it's supposed to be voluntary, not a single Rohingya of the ones that Myanmar finally agreed could come back agreed to go. And Myanmar puts on this fantastic show of officials all lined up at the border in neatly pressed uniforms with bits of paper, and they've got all this computer technology for screening people, putting their details in, packets of aid for them, knowing full well that not a single Rohingya is going to walk across that border. And the longer it goes on, the more Bangladesh is saying, if nobody else solves it, we will do it our own way. And their drastic solution is to dump a large proportion of the population down in Cox's Bazar onto Basan Char, this low-lying island.
Well, the proposal is 10%.
It's 10%, but that's one. It's a sort of. I feel in a way it's almost a threat, because I don't think anyone thinks they could easily do it. But they've certainly prepared the island. I think in the hope they're just hoping that somebody will come along and solve the problem for them. There are those who are arguing with Bangladesh. In the end, this is reality. These people aren't going anywhere else. You've got them, and it's not your fault. We'll give you all the help you like. But the official Bangladesh position is no, we can never accept them. We have to maintain the position that they will eventually go back to Myanmar, however improbable that seems.
Can I make one point, Gwen? I think it's important when we start talking about, well, what are the underlying causes of this? What needs to be done? What does Myanmar need to do? I think if the ICJ orders provisional measures for Myanmar to take certain steps, and we expect if they do so, we'll have a judgment within the next 4 or 5 weeks, then that presents an opportunity for the international community, for missions, for diplomatic missions, to then take something concrete to the government and say, you've been ordered to do these things, what are you doing? Can we help you achieve them? And I think it's really significant to keep coming back to what the UN fact-finding mission said at the end of its 444-page report, where it said, we don't need to keep starting at the beginning again, asking ourselves, what are the solutions to the crisis in Myanmar and northern Rakhine? The solutions are well known, and they refer to, for example, the Rakhine Advisory Commission's report of August 2017.
That's Kofi Annan's commission, you
the
mean?
Kofi Annan's commission, which set out credibly a large body of recommendations,
99.
which sometimes get forgotten in all of this. Issues such as address the issue of citizenship, close the IDP camps, economic development of Rakhine, humanitarian access, education. So it's not as if what needs to be done is a mystery. It is known what needs to be done, and I think that Advisory Commission's report, perhaps it's time to revisit it in the context of any provisional measures that might be ordered.
Oh, interesting. Can I segue from that point to Weiwei and to cite, you mentioned the Rakhine Advisory Commission. One of the commissioners on that commission, unfortunately, she's in Bangkok, but she's now in KL tonight. Letitia Vandenassem also was one of the ones raising this issue, these concerns about witness protection for both these cases at the moment, and then possibilities of further cases. So perhaps you could comment on that, Weiwei, that people like, I think, some well-known Rohingya representatives such as Tun Kin as well, has received threats and intimidation. I mean, you yourself have obviously had a lot of pushback. So how do these cases call witnesses and particularly ones perhaps who are in particularly sensitive positions? Is there concern amongst more prominent Rohingya about that situation?
As we are fighting for a cause that is not popular, is not supported by the public people in Myanmar, it is not surprising for me to have to face backlash or attack or intimidations or threat, and it's very normal for me. I have received tens of thousands of threats, intimidations over the last 7 years of my work. Sometimes, every 3 months, a series of this consistent social media troll campaigns against me. It has been there. And, like it includes death threat to the rape. And it doesn't mean we should ignore all of this. And we still don't have a solution for how do we deal with this condition. I think it's we all, who are working on this issue should have a discussions and find a way out. And all supporters has to come up with, like suggestions and tools for us to have to create our own protections. But when it comes to the court, specifically for the witnesses, I am not sure about what is the procedure and processes. I have heard some, witness protections in ICC, which is very weak, kind of, and flawed. And I'm not, I don't know, I have no knowledge about the protections at the witness protection for the ICJ. I think this is interesting, not interesting, this is very essential, and it's key for the witness to be able to really come up and testify and have safety and security. Right. Whoever is bringing the witness, it's a huge responsibility. Right. We should be asking and talking with the court about this. Right. I guess, especially if we want to have a witness from the camps or even from Burma, where they are living in, the environment itself doesn't provide the level of security that those countries is much more lower than the level of security that somebody who is living in Europe. So it is very critical that we start discussing about the witness protections. But I don't have very clear knowledge about it. I am very concerned.
Right, I see. So the main thing is you feel that it could possibly deter some people from giving evidence in the...
Yeah, exactly. Because people might not feel safe about this.
Right. Okay. Well, presumably with nearly 1 million people who suffered in some way or another, there'll be enough brave people who can come forward.
It doesn't mean we should undermine the witness protection aspect, and we should not talking about it. We should definitely, talking about and calling for the witness protection.
Thank you.
Seriously.
Thank you. And I think does that
I just want to have one more thing.
Yes.
I just want to talk about one more thing about Kofi Annan Commission recommendations. We have to remember that the government is not actually implementing the most important recommendations out of 88 recommendations. But those recommendations that they claim to be implementing are actually not also implementing in a correct approaches, correct manner. They're actually using these recommendations as a tool to institutionalize discriminations and apartheid. For example, camp closures, closing the current camps and building another permanent structures of camps or villages, which will permanently create segregation among the Rakhine and Muslims, the Rohingya. Those kind of the practices the implementation has been utterly kind of flawed, not only flawed, reversely affecting. Right. At the same time, for education, they are creating segregated education, kind of limited education system, which is what we call distant education systems. And I'm really afraid that the claim is not actually what has been done in the ground, and we have to give close attention to it, how these recommendations are being implemented. And the government has been calling for the investment and development aid in Rakhine State. When you have this appetite-like condition, when you have when the Rohingyas are put into the under the confinement, how can we really expect the development and equal access to the all development projects and
exactly
and assistance on economy itself? And it is really, I mean, all of you understand, but what I'm saying is we need to talk about these things.
Right. I think you're right, and I think what we'll probably hear, continue to hear from Aung San Suu Kyi and her government is that they have implemented 90% of the recommendations.
Yeah.
The trouble is they haven't implemented the ones that are really hard to implement, the most important ones like freedom of movement and citizenship. But anyway, I think that really wraps up. Okay, there's one more. It's what, sorry?
I'm not representing much of anything other than a person that lives in Myanmar.
Sure. Please just introduce yourself.
So, my name is Angela. I don't represent much of anything else other than a person who lives there and listens to the people. And I hear both sides. I hear exactly what Wawa is talking about, where she's saying the government says, oh, we offer this, but the people don't feel safe. And at the same time, I hear very well-educated people in Myanmar saying to me, oh, they don't come back because they think there's going to be a better offer. And it's propaganda, maybe. I don't know. Again, I don't represent anything. I don't know. I'm just listening to what I hear where I live.
Well,
so for me, this is very heartfelt, and it was just coincidence. I'm in Bangkok today again.
Well, it's very common. And
No, but it's
well,
the
I was
thing
going
is-
to say though, the fact you live in Yangon gives you absolute sort of authority to
Just a little bit.
say
This
this.
much,
But,
this
but
much.
what's your question?
I actually don't have a question.
Right, you just wanted to make that point,
I just
yeah.
want to share that
Yeah.
I can see both sides of this
Yeah.
because I hear it.
I think
Every day.
if we sum it up, basically, everyone's seen the. I mean, some of the protests are actually probably people are being bussed in, but there is genuine, strong feeling supporting Aung San Suu Kyi is defending the country.
Yes.
There's a completely different perspective in much of Myanmar, and that's reality.
But
so, what does Suu Kyi do?
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
There is, but I do speak with very well-educated people there, and they believe certain things that Wawa would probably say are not true, that I know are not true, because I hear from other workers, other people who work in different sectors, who don't just accept what is told.
It's just about information, though, isn't it? Where do you get your information? And after all, the information that we've been putting out and everyone here has been putting out is based on very detailed testimony from people in the camps.
Right.
And those people definitely do want to go home.
This I know.
Yeah.
I truly believe in this.
Can I respond to you, Miss?
Yes, please.
So, in crimes of genocide or these gross human rights violations, there is no such thing as both sides. There is a victim and perpetrators.
Of course.
And it's very clear by seeing the proportion itself.
Yeah.
And for us, it doesn't matter what educated intellectual racist or non-racist says. And we also have to remember that in all genocidal society and incidents, the well-educated people are deeply involved. So that's it.
Yeah. And
There is no such fact that we have to argue there is two sides, both side narrative. No, that's not true.
No, but I guess what I'm trying to say is I agree. But what I find in reality, living there, is there are people who should know
we just have
better,
to say that that's
who
wrong
should
and
know
that's it.
better, who should know better, who
Because
accept.
the people are brainwashed for 40 plus years. There is no critical thinking and rational thinking at all. I mean, from the Aung San Suu Kyi to majority of the Burmese population. But I'm not saying everybody. There are a lot of people who I work with are supportive and trying very hard to change the society. There are people like that too.
Yes.
But the majority is brainwashed. So we know that. That's why we have to
I think
protect
she-
people, and
I
we
agree with you.
we need to bring the case to the international forum.
Yes, we are.
I just hope that if you bring to the international forum, I mean, both of these gentlemen have told us that there's only so much we can do at the international forum. So I just hope it advances. And thank you so much for putting yourself out there and speaking and doing all that. And yeah, as I said, I'm not really anyone to speak about this stuff. I just know I live there and I hear both sides, and
As
I'm
I said-
constantly trying to help people understand that they maybe don't know.
No,
Sorry.
totally.
I mean, Weiwei's completely right. There aren't two sides to atrocities. But,
No.
you know, on the other hand, the reality in Myanmar is huge numbers of the population believe the official version and do not believe all the stuff that comes elsewhere.
I think that was her main point. Actually, was just pointing out that there's a huge difference in views when you sit in Yangon. But thank you very much for that. No, don't apologise. That's a very good. We like to hear all views. Yeah. No, thank you. You are so right. It's a deeply divisive issue. I'd just like to thank everyone, particularly our panelists. Okay, all right. Final one, if ever. Okay, last one. Please identify yourself.
Yes, I'm Sam Wright, club member. I'm wondering if using the word genocide and defining it as you have is going to backfire politically when China wakes up to the reality that a million Uyghurs in concentration camps who are Muslim, who are a different ethnic group, who are having their identity stripped away from them, when they wake up to this, will they not then become...
Change their position on Myanmar. And
Pardon? I am doing that.
No, were
if
you
you
saying...
can't follow, I'll make it simpler.
No, I was just...
But I'm coming to the question. Is that all right?
Yes.
And the question is this then going to lose you the Chinese support and others who maybe are doing similar things? Thank you.
Arguably, there's no Chinese support for this at the moment. I mean, China obviously is a signatory to the International Court, but aside from that, China has really played a very, very detached role on the whole Rohingya issue. It's a very, very interesting comparison that. You're quite right. If the ICJ can be used to show genocide in the case of the Rohingyas, why could it not be used in the case of the Uyghurs? And I think that's a very interesting question. As things stand, China's position on many things is quite hard to read. On the Rohingya issue so far, it's been a very, very cautious position that is largely focused on its own immediate diplomatic interests, not on a deeper resolution of the problem.
Yeah.
I was merely saying that I was wondering whether your point was suggesting that perhaps this would shift China on the Security Council positions and its constant blocking of or vetoing of resolutions on Myanmar. But since we've just been told that by China that Uyghur camps no longer exist, clearly there aren't any Uyghur camps left. Anyway, okay, so...
Can I answer?
Yeah.
Wait.
Yes, I want to answer.
Sorry?
I want to answer the question.
You want to say something? Yeah. Yes or
Yeah.
no? Yeah.
Can
Yes.
you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, no one should be compromising the legal, the crimes or the legal definitions, just for the sake of Chinese support or whatsoever to support. We have to acknowledge the crime as it is to prevent further atrocity crimes, not only in Myanmar, but also, around the other part of the globe, including the China. And this could be actually an opportunity to remind the perpetrators that, they cannot get away from the genocide. And this is very important, I think, a decision that the court will make. And this will impact a lot of, this will be very, very, very meaningful for many other minorities who are targeted just because who they are, including the Uyghurs.
Right. Well, thank you very much for that. And I think on that note, wish you luck in The Hague, Wei Wei.
Thank you.
And thank you very much to Kingsley for the dash from New Zealand via Yangon to be with us tonight. And Jonathan, dashing from your sick bed. So, and thank you all remaining for sticking with us. And I hope you learned something. I think we've had some really original insights tonight, actually. That's one of the clearest explanations I've heard on the differences and the issues involved in the cases. So thanks, all of you. Bye. Bye, Wei Wei.
Bye. Thank you.
Wait, wait, wait.